Dr. Shiv Dawson is South Africa's first integrative psychiatrist, treating patients holistically, addressing the mind, body, and soul.
You can feel lonely despite being amongst people. You can feel lonely in a marriage.
Her approach goes beyond symptoms, looking at the root causes of our emotional struggles through a holistic lens.
So they've done fMRI scans of the brain, and what it reveals is that lonely people's brains perceive threat twice as much.
We explore the physical and spiritual aspects of loneliness, how it roots itself in our very biology and energy centers.
There isn't a real grounding in our lower root chakra, which neurobiologically is associated with the plexuses of the pelvis and the hypogastric nerves. But energetically, it seems to be our connection to the earth.
Dr. Shiv guides us through practices for healing and reconnecting with our true selves.
All these parts that we've banished had a place within us.
Welcome to Alt Life, where we break free from the chains of conventional thinking and explore the limitless possibilities of a redefined reality. Thanks for being here, Dr. Shiv. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you.
I think it's such an exciting topic, and I didn't actually realize until recently how great a public health concern it is, and that it's actually become an epidemic. And I was really interested in your just your experience of loneliness and how that's kind of triggered this conversation coming to light.
I think that's interesting because you asked me a question now. So since I moved to South Africa, like I was living in Johannesburg, and yeah, I feel like I didn't know I was lonely until I wasn't lonely anymore. I don't know if that makes sense. But now looking back, I think a lot of the issues I faced and like the struggles with adjusting to South Africa was like this feeling of being different, being misunderstood or not understood, or not being able to connect with other people. And I think all that has to do with feeling like lonely, feeling like you really want to be accepted.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
And I think what research is showing is that it's actually a much more pervasive experience for many people. You know, they did a huge study at Harvard. It was a 75-year longitudinal study of adult development. And the single most important determinant of happiness and well-being and longevity was actually the quality of your social relationships. So they discovered that loneliness is actually toxic. And currently, about 60 to 70% of people believe or experience a sense of frequent, chronic loneliness, particularly in a vulnerable age group 16 to 24, which is our, when our brains are just maturing into adulthood, and then the obvious cases of the elderly where in many cultures they're not really revered or included anymore. And so this level of toxicity of loneliness equates, in terms of health determinants, as almost the same equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Half a pack of cigarettes a day causes the same level of stress to your body. And I think what's really important to distinguish, however, is the difference between loneliness as a feeling construct and social isolation and being alone or solitude. And so what we believe is that loneliness, you can feel, as you were saying, you can feel lonely despite being amongst people. You can feel lonely in a marriage. And it's an internal subjective experience of not having proper connection, not having meaningful, quality-filled relationships. Whereas social isolation is deemed as a physical aspect. It's more of an exclusion, either because of illness or there's physical exclusion, which is what we noticed during the COVID pandemic. or because of some other case, they might be xenophobia, or this aspect of aloneness. And I think this is where people are getting confused, and spirituality is disorientating people, because being alone is a personal choice to take solitude, which feels restorative and allows for contemplation and reflection, and is part of understanding the internal workings of yourself, but it doesn't give you that sense of not belonging to anything.
Solitude is something that we choose, but loneliness is almost like something that we're not ready for, like something that we just experience. And we didn't choose it. And that's what almost makes it like a bad thing.
Well, to me, loneliness is always akin to grief. There is the same aspect of longingness and a feeling of disconnection where, like David Whyte, the poet, says, you are looking at the world, but you can't really inhabit. So there is an experience of other people are doing okay, but I am not. And I think what people have to realize is that it's actually a universal phenomenon. And why it's such an important conversation to have is that I think what's happening is it's actually revealing our collective shadow, because it's as a result of the loneliness and disconnect that we feel as beings that we create incorrect choices in the world. So the genocides, the atrocities, the abuse are all related to, I don't have a relationship with self, and therefore cannot imagine that I could have a proper relationship with somebody other. So it's this absolute distortion of our wholeness as a being, our construct of our relationship with self, that causes this very pathological external behavior. And the research says that, prior to the 19th century, people didn't really talk about loneliness. So did it exist or did it not exist? And potentially it actually didn't exist, because we needed to be close to our families. We had to work in tribes. We had to support our nations. We were part of religious institutions because we needed other people to survive and thrive. But then there became this push towards radical individualization and independence and industrialization, where it was about productivity and efficiency and everything in the external world at the cost of what was happening for our internal lives. And what we've noticed now is that people, 1 in 4 people feeling so lonely, which is the same statistic as depression, 1 in 4, that the way that we're conducting our lives is actually not necessarily supportive for deep meaning and deep happiness. And, there could be many influences, like this aspect of urbanization. So people are moving away from their families for opportunities. They're living in tall buildings. They're going to work in cars. There's not a lot of ability to connect intimately with people. And so, the studies show that lonely people don't have a lack of social people around them. They have the lack is actually the quality of the interaction. So now,
Okay, so let's actually, like, to start with, perhaps you can give us an idea of what does it mean to be lonely? Like, are there any physical markers of somebody, like something in the brain that maybe shows us that this person is feeling lonely, or something in the body that shows us that this person is feeling like, I just want to understand. So what is happening on a mental level? You're talking about a disconnection from the self.
so there are definitely biological aspects which now can be measured in people who are lonely. So they've done fMRI scans of the brain, and what it reveals is that lonely people's brains perceive threat twice as much as normal people, not normal, but people who are not experiencing a level of loneliness, which is really incredible on an evolutionary basis. So if you now feel as though you've got nobody to rely on, you're definitely going to be much more hypervigilant in searching for danger. And the impact of that in the brain is not necessarily beneficial. So your prefrontal cortex is where you make your decisions and it's your executive functioning. That ability actually reduces. So now you're not thinking and discerning clearly enough anymore. You're making very deep, primal decisions about your environment.
And the limbic brain.
Yes, and the amygdala, which is part of the limbic brain, your emotional processing center, is much more hypervigilant, it's turned on. Coupled with the fact that your hippocampus, which is where your memory and learning is, that shrinks in chronic loneliness. So now your accessibility to memories and learning is also different. And some of your networks are also different. So there's something called the default mode network, which has become very popularized through the psychedelic psychotherapy. But it's what I call your kind of Woody Allen circuit, which is the part that thinks about yourself a lot of the time. But with lonely people, it becomes very negatively ruminating. It thinks and thinks about the same sort of thing. So a lonely person actually becomes a little more paranoid about the external environment and suspicious and cautious. And that effect actually has a repelling effect. So other people can experience angst that the lonely person has because this being feels under threat. And they then experience it. So they say that loneliness could actually be contagious.
Yeah. Oh my God, that's the crazy thing. I actually read that. I read that as well when I was like researching this. That apparently, if you hang out with lonely people, then you can also be lonely.
So, I mean, they did researching. There's a beautiful guy who's done a lot of research. He was a neuroscientist, and his name is John Capioppo, I think, but his surname is quite difficult. Yes, there we go. Thank you so much. And they try to investigate, and you could probably speak to this too about, and we'll probably talk about the medical treatments and remedies later, but yeah, can you just throw a couple of people together and say, there we go, you're all lonely, why don't you all be friends? And that didn't actually translate to people feeling less alone. So the people part is there. It wasn't touching their heart and their aspect of feeling worthy enough to have friendships. And so then they did another aspect where they said, well, we'll just support you. Can we give you a lot of psychologists and psychotherapists so you feel supported? Will that work? And it works to a certain level, but actually what people need is reciprocity in relationships. So it's no good in you coming to me as a psychiatrist, because it's a one-way relationship, really. I'm not being vulnerable with you, it's just you unburdening yourself. So there is that, but it's not dealing with a very deep aspect of loneliness. Then they tried, okay, well, maybe it's a communication or social skills problem. Maybe people aren't communicating well enough. And that also didn't support it. What was actually more appropriate and helpful was to help people identify that it was actually almost an evolutionary default aspect, and to help support them to recognize that the way that they perceive eye contact or body language, or becoming attuned with their own eye contact, body language, closeness, invitations, olive branches to connect, would make them feel reassured, that they dropped on their guard and would create a little bit more ease and connections again. So what they discovered in some of the research was what was most helpful was training people to understand these biological responses within themselves and to attune within their physical being how they were hyper aware of their own experience with other people. For example, eye contact or glances or body tonality, and misperceiving it somehow. And that they also had avoidance in offering olive branches or making gestures to connect. And so when they started to learn that about themselves, they had more comfort in lowering their guard, and which makes other people feel more comfortable and at peace and at ease of creating relationship.
That's amazing, because what you're saying is that actually the reason I feel lonely is because I'm blocked. And I know for me what that feels like in my body. Like for me personally, it literally feels like my heart is closed and I can feel it. And that's actually what's making me less able to connect with another, which is them making me feel rejected.
Yes. You see, so this is the beautiful thing about where we are as a species. And unfortunately, I think it's layered. We were talking about urbanization increasing our isolation, and isolation obviously triggers also fundamentally this bit of, well, I don't belong. Who do I belong with? And they talk about like having box lives, living in your concrete box, and then getting into a car or a tube and existing in that box, and then going to work and working in a cubicle and existing in that box. There's not a lot of ability to interact. And then with the influence of digitalization, they started to notice, just with the introduction of TV, that people were starting to have parasocial type of relationships. So there was an experience that the human beings on TV were my family or my friends, and they realized that when a series goes off, people are under the illusion that they're experiencing heartbreak. And I don't know if you couldn't relate to this, but I mean, I've had a character in a series who I just felt totally in awe of. And I was, I just wanted the series to continue because I wanted this relationship with this person that was in awe. And I think that's difficult for us, particularly as our overconnectivity has become so pervasively almost suffocating to some extent that we believe we're having proper interactions, but they're so shallow, it's so superficial. There's a lacking of complexity and depth. We're missing the nuances of subtle communication, eye contact, tone, smells, and resonance. And they did some studies with cancer patients, and they just believed, oh, well, now we can do everything online. But actually, what they showed is that the depression levels in the cancer patients coming to a support group online remained the same or slightly improved. But those who experienced face-to-face contact were actually much better off. The depression significantly reduced. And what I heard recently, I don't know who the investigator is, but the Gen Z group who actually, were literally born with a phone in their pockets, but through puberty, which is the vulnerable time, had a phone connected to them. And you can see, even at lunch tables with Gen Zs, it's part of a conversation. And they believe that it's natural, but there is actually damage that they think is happening within the brain that may not be reversible because of what we've described about the stress effects of loneliness within the brain. And not only that, those stress effects have an impact on immunity, on cardiovascular health, on your ability to sleep. You're complaining of your problem with insomnia, but there's a fragmentation of sleep that happens with loneliness and reduction of deep wave restorative sleep, where we go into our memories and I believe into our solar aspects to heal and to come into right relationship with our incarnation. And there are changes in some of the neurotransmitters as well. And so the differences in the neurotransmitters look very like depression, reduction in serotonin, which gives you this feeling of not being content, not being calm, reduction in dopamine, so not feeling motivated, not experiencing pleasure, and reduction in oxytocin, which is your bonding chemical. They're even designing nasal sprays that support oxytocin to try and help people connect. But is that, do we really need more chemicals? Obviously, that's helpful, but we can go into that a little bit later.
So I guess like my question then is like if my blockedness is causing me to feel disconnected from others, so I suppose, But then the loneliness is also causing me to feel depressed. So I wonder what comes first, the depression or the loneliness?
I think they're probably interchangeable. And I mean, it did studies to show that suicidality is associated with a feeling of emptiness, and emptiness as an aspect of loneliness in it. But kind of to your point around the blocked aspect and the internal nature of it, the relationships that we have often been modeled to us as children had not necessarily been perfect. We've all experienced a sense of abandonment or rejection, or feeling suffocated, or maybe enmeshed. And as a result of that, we interpret those aspects of relationship connectivity as something being fundamentally flawed within us. So our insecurity and our unworthiness creates these behavioral changes within us. So now we might try and we become even more, we try and desire more connection perhaps, or we withdraw even more. And so the aspect which I think is really important is that you're talking about a kind of a shutdown or fragmentation that happens. So as a little person, even if we had good enough parents, in a moment, a good enough parent, through impatience or desiring us to be compliant or criticizing us or being angry, might chastise us for being, too emotional or too loud or a bit selfish. And so we internalize that as something that cannot be tolerated in order to maintain connection to this important caregiver. So what happens in the wisdom of our consciousness is that we split and fragment off that part that's not tolerated. So our consciousness, in order to maintain connection to the caregiver, says, okay, I'm going to just silence that part that's too loud or selfish. And actually, if I could even banish it so it doesn't exist, then maybe this caregiver will adore me and idolize me and will remain close to me. But what happens as we get older is that fragmented shadow part doesn't go away. We can't actually suppress it until it disappears. It continues to knock on the door, requiring integration. And when we come into another relationship in our adulthood or in a group, that knocking is very evident because our conscious mind is remembering, oh, that part, I can't be too loud because that part wasn't really tolerated. So now we feel the disconnect of that part, a discomfort within us, a feeling of not being authentic. So shame ensues because of the separation that we feel from our internal landscape. And a big chasm between I'm not whole and there's this other part makes us feel not only ashamed, but deeply unworthy and flawed, and needing to present ourselves as perfect because our positive image is everything that's going to be love. And the more complications you've had in relationships in your earlier lives or through loss or grief or whatever, the more fragmented parts they are. And this is what I believe is the fundamental cure for loneliness, is understanding that this fragmentation happens in all of us, and being willing to acknowledge that there is something uncomfortable that needs to be addressed through a therapeutic process or through a spiritual process, but also being self-compassionate enough to realize that it is this universal phenomenon. And I think it's actually part and parcel of being human and incarnating as a soul on planet Earth. So we are removed from source. We come into a physical body that is dense, and that in itself is difficult and uncomfortable. And then we come into a world, and nowadays, in this day and age, our births are often medicalized. Our ability for our mothers to be in a postpartum period, which was very nourished and close, is much more difficult. Mums have to work. There isn't a village to take care of children anymore. So there are all of these aspects of separating. And I remember there being these newsreels when I was in my teens about Eastern European orphans and how they weren't getting touch or human connection. You remember those kind of visuals, hey?
So I don't know the visuals, but I think I read about it.
Okay, and they could not thrive without this human connection, and that doesn't go away just because you didn't get it as a child. We still need it as as older adults, and so the soul aspect, which I think is so interesting, that I want to kind of discuss with you. Yeah, I think what I want to stick into is this awareness of your heart being closed. And you say that in your own journey space, that doing some of the Joe Dispenza meditations and really doing some of the chakra meditations kind of leans into this idea that psychospiritually, our root chakra is what develops between the age of 1 and 3. And so do we have an experience of being physically safe, of being supported, of being nourished, of those needs being met at every turn? And if we don't, which I think a lot of people don't experience, there isn't a real grounding in our lower root chakra, which neurobiologically is associated with the plexuses of the pelvis and the hypogastric nerves. But energetically, it seems to be our connection to the earth. And if you think about trees, the deeper the rooting system, the grander and the taller the trees can grow. And I think it's similar for human beings. When we concentrate on our physical, our root chakra being stabilized, we get a sense existentially, spiritually, that we can trust our place in the universe. Emotionally, we don't feel so dissociated. We don't feel depressed. We don't feel as unmotivated. Physically, we don't feel fatigued or erratic, or as though our immune system isn't strong. And so I think that aspect, which kind of leads into the spiritual kind of precept of loneliness, is what is a challenge, really, because we're lacking the embodiment piece, or have lacked, or reversing into the embodiment piece in our spiritual evolution. There was a real emphasis through the 70s and 80s about going into higher realms, the more etheric aspect of our beingness, into meditative states and bliss states. And I think this is where the confusion around aloneness has come, that if we can connect to all that is around and up and outside of us, that we'll feel okay. But I think what my experience has been in my own life and with clients is that the deeper we can feel into our humanness and into our grounding and to our relationship with the earth and ourself, the easier that transition up and out and into bliss states is, but the less we feel disconnected from everything.
So does that mean that if we are able to, I know I'm probably just making this, simplifying it quite a bit, but does that mean that if we're able to connect with ourselves and connect with the earth and just be more grounded in us, that we won't feel lonely? And maybe we might even seek being alone, like the monks and the Sufis and the yogis that are looking, longing even to be on their own.
So I think that's quite a simplified version of it. But I agree. I actually think fundamentally, and it all comes down to this idea of belonging. So what do you belong to? Do you feel like you belong to the earth? Is she your mother? Is she supporting you? So what is your relationship to earth? Do you feel like you belong to yourself? And very few people feel like that. They betray themselves. They reject themselves. They don't forgive themselves. They and they're lacking in compassion with themselves. So it starts there, and then it goes out to, well, who do I want to be in my relationship with other people? And I think with the beautiful Indian and Sufi and Eastern masters who came to the West, they probably culturally already had a sense of tribe and family. It's very different, I think. They might even have felt a bit too suffocated or enmeshed within the relationship of their family and needed to, extrude themselves from that context in order to find their own sovereignty and truth.
I just want to go back to this thing that you said about connection to the self. To me, this is such an abstract concept. What does this mean? What does it mean when you say you're like abandoning yourself or you're betraying yourself? I think, what does it look like internally if you're not doing that anymore? Or what would you stop doing? Does that make sense?
But I think that's it's such an important question, isn't it? Because we can often throw out these psychotherapeutic pop psychology phrases like you just need to love yourself, you need to practice more self-care, more self-love. But you're right, what does it really mean? And I think that people can perceive the way that they are with themselves by the actions that they take. So are there moments in time where you would prioritize everybody else's needs and not your own, because you don't necessarily think you're worthy? So you think you're being kind and generous to other people, and that it's selfish to take care of your own needs. But that, on one level, is betraying yourself. But you don't believe that you are on equal footing to everybody else in your life, to take time to pursue the things that you really love, to have your own space to contemplate your own beliefs and values. It's the people-pleasing model, or the deep kind of withdrawn model of being. I think it's being hyper aware and acknowledging the triggers and the reactions that happen to you within relationship spaces, particularly intimate ones. So when do I feel rejected? When do I feel abandoned? When do I feel as though my partner can't see or hear me or value me? What's happening within me that makes me consider that perhaps there's a disconnect within the way that I relate to myself before this relationship with other. Does that make sense?
It. It's so a little bit like I understand what you mean when you say, well, do you put others' needs before yours? But I don't understand about the partner.
So maybe one example about, really not tending to personal needs and overriding intuition. You might feel exhausted from your week, and your partner might have an expectation that on a Sunday, family must come around and that we provide big social gathering.
Are you saying like you would put your partner's needs above your own, but that's actually, you're doing that because you want to connect with your partner? Like, I don't know, you want to build your relationship with your partner, but that's not necessarily, connecting.
Yes, I think that can sometimes be a codependent type of relationship where the other partner's needs trump your own, and there has to be this beautiful dance of reciprocity. But it's being able to identify in our own being, what is my primary state at the moment? So if I am really exhausted and I actually don't have anything to give, am I allowed to take time for myself and go for a walk on the beach, or, heaven forbid, even go away for a week and not be on the phone to anybody and really just be with myself? Or do I feel obliged that I have to unselfishly always be able to offer myself to other people? I couldn't possibly say no to an invitation, or I couldn't say no to my boss at work because, I have a fear that,
I'm gonna do another promotion, or I was like be seen as hardworking in heels. I think I'm guilty of that. I'm very guilty of that. And what's interesting is that actually I think it comes from wanting to have more opportunities to connect, or like maybe if I make my boss happy, then I'll be loved, right? Be loved, yes, connect.
yeah,
I mean, that is
yes, and what we're looking for is external validation.
yes.
Rather than actually, well, at the moment, it doesn't really work for me. But in my vulnerability of claiming how and why it doesn't work for me doesn't mean I'm distancing myself from you. I'm just owning what I need in this space and then generating, offering this olive branch of, well, when I have capacity, absolutely, I'll definitely connect with you or take on more work.
So I have some challenges with that. One is that I struggle to disappoint other people. Like if, like, let's say I said no to you, and I can see, and I mean, I struggle quite a bit. Maybe I should talk about exactly what right now. But like, let's say I say no to you, like you asked me to do some work and I say no to you, and I see your disappointment in your face. I feel like I have failed, like I have done something, like I've wronged you.
Yes. And that feeds back into the early fragmented part that wasn't allowed to say no and wasn't allowed to disappoint. But if we can get to a place of say, oh, I can see that's really disappointing for you, and I'm sorry, because I'm not going to kind of put words in your mouth, but is it because you feel overburdened, or why do I pick up the sense that you're feeling disappointed? That actually then enhances the intimacy connection, because that person can then has permission to say, oh, you know what, I actually wasn't feeling disappointed. I was just feeling insecure that I couldn't do it by myself. And now we've created a different energetic bond with the realization. Yes, yeah, vulnerability. And I like this kind of phrase of intimacy, into me see. So you can see into my inability at the moment to be able to please you, although I really want it, or to be present at this function because I'm too tired, or whatever it might be. And in that way, I give you permission to be vulnerable too in this space.
But you would have to be speaking to somebody else who's emotionally mature enough to do that. Whereas I find that most people that you would connect with or meet, or, most people that you may call your friends, may not be at that place yet where if I say to you, I can see that's disappointed you, they might just say, no, it hasn't. And that's it, like, stop that. So just from a very practical perspective, I'm thinking that would be a challenge that people might.
Yeah, and I don't disagree with that. Although potentially you're supporting in the germination of a training process there. So they might initially fend it off because in their fragmented self, they weren't ever allowed to admit to be weak. But maybe in the next interaction, they might be a little bit more vulnerable.
That's just interesting about like how we can maybe not fall into those patterns. I want to like go back and talk about something that you mentioned. Like I personally, I tend to withdraw when I feel disconnected. So I tend to block myself off so that I won't be hurt again. I'm not going to give anyone an opportunity so that I don't feel rejected again. But I know that there are people that might try to reach out more and more and more. And what I want to ask you is, what is happening in that dynamic, in that relationship? Like, let's say now I'm very keen to be friends with you, and it's coming from a place of loneliness, but somehow I think you are able to fill that void in me. And I'm reaching out to you, but you are like really, you're not feeling it, and maybe my desperation is kind of, so what exactly is happening energetically?
Yes, so I think this is also so interesting. So neurobiologically, this kind of relationship with addiction is quite similar to loneliness. So loneliness, there is a longing and addiction for the other to fill this aspect of self that I can't nourish within me. And there's a craving, and the part of the brain that is implicated in part of the addiction pathways is also implicated in loneliness, the insula. And so I think there is what we were talking about previously, this almost repelling effect that happens with loneliness. We've often heard of people saying, I just need to find a soulmate, just so desperate to find the one, and it needs to be extraordinary. And the very act of needing it to be in this way, I think, sends off signals, as you were saying, of desperation that other people pick up on, and then the other people withdraw because it feels quite intense, because they can sense that it's actually greediness that's requiring connection, not the heart-based openness that's requiring connection. And then the lonely person, having this hypervigilant sensitivity, then notices the backing off body language in the other, and then gets a fright, and then withdraws even more. And so I think,
It's the energy of desperation.
yeah, I think so too. I was just trying to think about the chords that happen. We believe that with every interaction, there is an energetic cord, almost like an umbilical cord that moves from one person to the other person. But for it to be free flowing and even, there can't be a vampiric, almost energy draining from the one person. So in that energetic cord, if there's an equal balance of give and take and seeing and vulnerability and openness, then it feels healthy and strong. But if the one person is needing a little bit more, then the other person is giving off their energy and it feels too much, and then there's a block that happens.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So I suppose it's like that very difficult thing to do, right? How do you stop wanting something that you so desperately want?
I think it's to do with the inner work, which is actually really uncomfortable. To do true shadow work is highly provocative for the person, because you are going into your deepest parts that you've been avoiding your entire life and having to shine a light on it and having to breathe into allowing that unintegrated part to come home. So, the solution for addiction is not necessarily stopping the drug, although that is the external manifestation, it's connection. If addicted people feel connected, they actually don't need the addiction anymore. And similarly for loneliness, when we connect deeply within ourselves and recognize that all these parts that we've vanished have a place within us, that they're calling for something. The part that was too noisy, what did it need? It needed attention. Okay, so let's give it attention instead of not giving it attention. And how can I bring that into myself through aspects of contemplation or working with a therapist or doing parts work or doing family systems work or doing psychedelic work? And as we become more attuned to the missing aspects within ourselves and why we are what we're seeking for in every moment, and it starts to dissipate a little bit. And what we have most feared, being alone, is then starts to become what we most desire. So I grew up as an early child for a long time until my brother came around at the age of 12, and then we lost 2 children in our family, quite kind of heartbreakingly. And so I also made a vow as a young person that I would be surrounded with friends. I would suffocate myself with friends. As my friend Sam says, I would peanut butter layer myself with friends. So I needed a huge network of friends, and I was going to have lots of children to fill that void, and I was going to have a partner that I would remain with forever. And as I've kind of explored in my own relationship with myself, as I've recognized where those little parts of myself felt abandoned or rejected or not worthy enough or not funny enough or whatever constructs or narrative I had about myself, and that tended to those aspects within myself, what I crave so much is time with myself in my very, very, very busy life that I created for myself. And it's now being alone, being solitary, that feels so unbelievably nourishing for me.
I have so many questions, like literally so many, and we can go in so many different directions. One question I want, like, I just hear this all the time, shadow work, but I don't know I know it means like kind of working with parts of you that you don't like or you're trying to shut down, but I don't know what it means. What would I do to do the shadow work?
So I think it's always easier to do in community, so with others.
Yeah.
So either with a therapeutic aide who's aware of it, or in a group of like-minded, emotionally aware friends who can kind of point out little foibles. And it won't be as scary or intimidating as you might imagine, because if I had to ask you, what are the parts of yourself that you're kind of insecure about? Not that I'm asking you this, but that you're insecure about, or that you hide, or that are really problematic for you. It would be very easy to identify those, and it might translate initially as something very physical, and I just need to be really successful. But why? I need to be, I need to leave a legacy. Do you really? Why? So kind of unpacking the shoulds, needs, musts, have tos of our world. And then identifying, is there anything in my life that is draining me of energy and power? And like really taking time to look at that part of self. And so it's just an investigation. It's a curious investigation of the relationship that we have with us.
How would you do it? Would you meditate in a certain way? Is there some kind of practice around it? I know there might be many, but if you could just like give us one.
So I think what I find most helpful with my clients is that having a practice like you were talking about, a meditative practice, is a critical component, because one needs to have time with one's own thoughts to feel the restlessness, to feel the subconscious patterns that keep arising. Then one needs to have openness and curiosity to look at what patterns are repeating in one's closest relationships. So I don't know if you know, but with my partner and I, and my husband and I, we've been together for 20 years, it's the same little triggers that cause us friction over and over again. And, we can talk about them until we're blue in the face, but what's actually happening is that my partner's pattern from his own conditions in early life is meeting my pattern and causing friction, which is really important. It's got nothing to do with him as a person or with me as a person. It's just the pattern. And then we can uncover, well, where does that pattern come from? So my pattern in my home is that I need harmony above all else. And so I become hyper vigilant in my family if there's fighting, or if people speaking nicely, or everybody should just simmer down, and it shouldn't be too dramatic or histrionic. And that comes from my own internal landscape of things needing to feel very peaceful. Whereas my husband is quite a volatile character, much more Mediterranean and passionate, and he speaks his mind, and so that can be triggering for me. But likewise, when I need everything to be all simmered down and contained, my pattern, it can make him feel like he's not allowed to have a voice. What he experiences is not valid. So it's just having the curiosity to evaluate those aspects. So it's the meditative self-reflective part, it's the patterns within relationships, and then it's being very honest with yourself around the harm that you're doing to yourself in particular ways. So do I always tend to have a relationship with a friend who is very needy and constantly asking and draining of my energy? What's that about?
Why do I need to have a relationship with that? Yes, I really want to know actually. I wanted help. Why am I doing it? I don't understand. Because there are people that are quite draining, but somehow I like them.
That it's about having awareness of, well, what is the draining telling me? So our body's constantly communicating signals. So I feel drained in that place. Is it because that person continuously talks about themselves and their problems and their complaints? And so do you feel validated as a good listening ear, or like you could solve problems by listening to that complaint? Or does it also help maintain a level of disconnection for you, where you don't actually have to reveal anything that's going on in your life?
So do you get an opportunity to complain about things that aren't working so well in those dynamics?
So it's that part, I think, that's really critical. And then looking at one's health. So I think that physically our body is communicating. Are we carrying too much weight? Is our immune system not good? I've often thought about skin being a boundary, a barrier. What is that telling us? And so it's just these invitations of just pulling up the hood of ourself. But it takes dedication and discipline to either journal or take time to contemplate or really delve into the depths of some of these things. And then there are other modalities that are psychotherapeutic. So you can do family therapy, where you look at the relationships that you have within your system and how that might relate to your own internal family system. Or you can do a type of gestalt or parts therapy, which is what we kind of talked about before, about looking at the fragments of self. So you can kind of disidentify the part that has been fragmented and then embody it. So what I would do with a client that's feeling really depressed is I'd say, well, there's a part of you that feels depressed. Can we go into her and discover what she's all about? And then we actually role play that part. We find out how old she is, what is she needing, what is she doing, what is she lacking, what does she need to express physically? And then that depressed part might actually feel another part that is completely abandoned or suicide. So we start to look at these aspects of myself from an objective point of view, so that it becomes a play, really. And as we understand these different character aspects of this masterpiece that is us, we can start to pull them together.
Yeah, it sounds like what I guess I would do when I was a child, there's this doll and there's this doll and they're in this kind of relationship and we enact the whole thing.
Yes, exactly. That's what they do in play therapy, kind of sand tray. Yeah, therapy, yeah.
I wanted to ask, I guess it goes into the fragmentation, but I read something about self-rejection and loneliness. Can you talk a bit about what's happening there?
So I think it's this concept of the fragmentation where it is believing our subconscious mind, our consciousness believing that there is a part of us that is not allowed to fully express. So maybe there was, in my early life, we couldn't be angry. That was not tolerated. And so we always had to be happy, bubbly, effervescent, enthusiastic. So the angry part of me was banished, and I used to think, oh, well, I don't experience anger. I'm just not an angry person. But that is a self-rejecting part, because every human being feels anger, and anger is a very, very valid, important boundary setup of this is not right for me, and I'm not agreeing to this type of interaction. And so it's the rejection that has happened in that early life of the untolerated parts for somebody else or for ourselves. Maybe we have experienced through discrimination or through in whatever form it is, that we're not okay. It's how we present to the world with the color of our skin, with our gender, with how beautiful or how not beautiful we are, and that we internalize and try and keep in the shadows and reject ourselves and hate ourselves and betray ourselves and abandon ourselves because it's just fundamentally flawed, and we don't have the mechanisms and haven't been taught either in school or in spirituality how to reintegrate that, to accept that this is human, this is part of the condition, the fragility of being human. That, there's such a beautiful story. There was a New York journalist who, I think it was 2008, 2009, David wrote, who got kidnapped by the Taliban and he was, with 2 other colleagues, Afghan colleagues, was separated and isolated for about 8 months. And obviously experienced extreme isolation and hopelessness and despair and fear and all that you can imagine, being kidnapped and not really knowing if he was ever going to be rescued. And the way he said he navigated that sense of terror was that he firstly started to notice around him the environment and how the environment continued to exist despite him. And he had started to develop a level of gratitude with the beauty, with, his co-kidnappees and then what was even more beautiful about that interconnectedness was he started to identify similarities between himself and his captors. So, his captors gave him the Quran initially to read, which he refused. But then he brought it in, and he experienced a level of salvation because there were truths in there that he could relate to, and he understood that his captors were on some level, doing what they believed deep down was right for their religious, expression, for their family, for their nation, or whatever it might be. And so his book called, Rope and a Prayer, really examines this idea that spending time with self, being isolated, can be the most unbelievably traumatic experience. But with hope and dedication, it can also bring out the most unbelievable realizations around the importance of resilience and the importance of relationships being fundamentally the most critical thing, because all he wanted during that time of kidnapping wasn't to go back to work and write the book that he wanted, was his family, his intimate connections. And so the quality of his relationships subsequently was profound, really investing in the people that served him, really making time every moment to interact with whoever it might be, the barrister or the cashier.
And he was able to do that even, I guess that's once he got over that trauma and started seeing his loneliness differently, he was also able to do that while he was still captive.
Well, look, I think that's a very extreme case. I think that he had moments of this kind of spiritual realization, but probably only subsequently started to put it all in place and really came back as a fundamentally changed human being. And so I think it also speaks to the preparation for us as human beings to imagine that there is probably a time in our life where we could spend time alone, in solitude, in isolation. My deep belief is that it's a necessary part of the maturation of going from your first adult life into the second adult life. So Jung describes this process individuation requiring a period of solitude, and we know that the great men in life have taken periods of solitude. Buddha under the Bodhi tree, Jesus in his 40 days in the desert, Muhammad in the cave of Hira, Mandela. So even Plato said, remove yourself from society and distraction to hear your own truth. So I think there is, when you're prepared for it and you're taking it willingly, there is a great benefit, because then you really are allowing yourself to meet what I call the hungry beasts, the parts of you that are continuously gnawing at you for some level of awareness or integration, that we, because of the discomfort that makes us feel, have overly frenetic, busy, full lives. When I say to people, I'm going to go out into the wild for 4 days and not eat and do a vision quest, and I know a lot of people have done much greater, better things. A lot of people say, oh, I could never do that. Could never be alone. But what does that mean? We can't actually be alone with ourselves. We're actually terrified of being in nature, and we're terrified of the conversations that we need to have with ourselves. We just don't have the skills yet to embrace that relationship with ourselves.
I think that one of the fears is if I would think very practically, I think now I really enjoy being alone. I think I've always enjoyed being alone, actually. I would correct that. But now I'm able to use my alone time very productively, like by connecting to everything around me.
Yes.
I wasn't able to do that in the past. And one of the scariest parts about being alone is the thoughts that your mind gives you, because it feels like you're not, I believe now that we choose our thoughts, but you know, it didn't feel like that then. It just felt like my mind was creating these thoughts and it's giving it to me. They tend to be negative. Like my mind is not giving me happy thoughts to be. It's not like just one day you say gratitude, like, just thankful for everything around me, or it's not giving me gratitude or love or any of those things. It's actually just giving me very negative things. It's making me ruminate. Like this. So it feels like I'm not doing that. It feels like my mind was doing that to me.
Well, if for me, it's the fragmented parts that are doing that. They're speaking. And so, when it becomes too painful, maybe we need treatment to silence it a little. But I think the problem with psychiatry is that that's all we want to do is silence the voices. Well, what happens if the voices have really something profound to say? Can we sit in the discomfort of it? Can we build our resilience physically, emotionally, and spiritually to listen to it? Okay, so what are you so fearful of? What is so unworthy that you're willing to commit suicide? What makes you so unlovable that you're willing to shut yourself away from everybody and stuff your face? Whatever it might be. And the addiction part is that I think without even realizing it, we form addictions in order that we don't have those scary thought processes happening. So, the binge watching of series or being on our phone continuously, not ever really being in prolonged periods of not being productive or not being stimulated is what makes us really anxious. And not only does it amplify the anxiety, that it's impeding us from really addressing it.
What was your personal experience of being alone? So I know you've done you spent time in the Amazon and then you went away in the desert. That's what I heard in your milestone. Now I want to know, what is that like when you go away and you're just by yourself with your thoughts, no phone, no nothing? What do you do?
So I think that's a really good question. And I'm naturally a very busy person. I love to be stimulated. I love novelty. I've got a very curious mind. So I want stuff all the time. And that's, part of my, that's part of what's detrimental to me. And I think initially there was physical resistance. So I felt uncomfortable and I felt bored and I felt critical of the process. And then, then I'd get a hive and I'd feel my throat would swell. And so the body was kind of extruding all of this toxicity that I was holding around just being with myself and creating more and more distraction about, this is ridiculous, I shouldn't do this. And, I was fine by myself. So it creates all of this noise around it. And then the mind feels like it's growing crazy. And there's almost like spiritual psychosis that happens where one can feel like we're becoming dissociated and disorientated. But eventually, when you navigate all of that mess and noise and chaos and just learn to sit, it becomes peaceful.
Is it possible that someone attempts this and goes crazy?
So, your professional view. Look, I think it really depends on the intention and the psychological resilience of a person to begin with. I don't believe that human beings are at risk being in nature. So, I mean, obviously there's the obvious risks that we don't have to talk about, the animals or whatever. But actually, the more people spend alone in nature, the healthier they get. And so my advice is just go and spend hours in the ocean, spend time in forest, hours in the forest, hours on the mountain, repeatedly, and see if there's not a benefit.
And what if you went away and you just, I would think that before I found meditation, I would probably just be spending hours ruminating. Is that a risk that you just spend all those days ruminating and you don't?
So then I guess the intention is, well, so after all the kind of brain vomit of the rumination, are you going to be disciplined enough to see whether or not you can discover what part is communicating all this rumination and whether or not you want to do something about it? So it can become a kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, the rumination, where it feels quite indulgent and it supports the aspect of ourselves that feels victimized, like somebody else needs to rescue us or pacify us or soothe us. But if you go with the intention of, I'm going to get to the bottom of it and I'm going to dig into that ruminating part endlessly and really examine what are the 80% the themes. Our brains think the same thing 80% of the time. Yes. Like, what are those themes? Do we actually know? Put them in a list. Do I want to be thinking about that endlessly? Am I thinking about how poor I am all the time, how fat I am all the time, how I don't have friends? Well, if that's not really what you want to be thinking about, is there something more supportive to be considering? And how do you align with that, really?
So I guess like what I do, and I think a lot of people do, is that we think that if we think about it enough, we might solve the problem. And I've had that experience in the past where I've thought about something so much. Actually, like in my case, and I'm sure it's like that for many other people, I feel like if I work hard on this, like if I think, I did my research at GIVES, I got a very high mark. That was MBA research.
Yes.
Anyway, so the way that I won that battle was because I just thought about it all the time. And that's how I excelled at it. And so I wonder if there's like a part of us that feels like we have to keep thinking about it until we find a solution. Yeah.
And I think that's, maybe that's part of our culture. And maybe it's also a belief that we independently have to find the one answer. But it could also be related to, our thinking strategies may not be sophisticated, and we can explore different ways of creatively thinking about things rather than necessarily having to exhaust ourselves by just going over the same piece and analyzing the consequences or the pitfalls all the time, and also allowing ourselves the luxury that having space from thinking often provides the opportunity for the third part or the third way, which I feel is kind of the answer that wasn't human designed, it was kind of other designed, to infiltrate. There needs to be space for that to come in.
I want to ask about how you came to this work. It's very rare to talk to someone especially in the mental health field, and as being a psychiatrist, so you're a medical doctor and you've studied. How did you come to this?
So I think I was telling you earlier that as a child, I was very interested in the mystical realms. And so there was always this openness and curiosity. And I came from a very medical family, surgeons actually. So it was a very specific type of medicine. And I was interested in human extraordinariness. So as a young person, I was absolutely obsessed with the Holocaust, and I couldn't understand how some people had experienced that environment in the concentration camps and had been able to find something within them to be artistic or to thrive or to have just been able to maintain a semblance of something otherly despite all that catastrophe. And that really kind of pushed me into psychiatry. And I, as a relatively sensitive person, I'd also just experienced a hardship in my own early life and made me curious around that. And then I think when my father was dying of cancer and he had only 18 months to live, and his approach to it was a very surgical approach, medical approach, I knew it was going to kill him. And I said as much, and I taught myself functional medicine and integrative medicine. And because he had no other option but to listen to some of my whisperings, because, he knew that his prognosis was so poor, and he attempted some of the things that I advised, he lasted 5 years, which was phenomenal given his stage of cancer and the progression of it. Never lost his hair with chemo, was able to stay at work. And so I was able to then apply some of those strategies with my own patients. And I don't know if it was just because of the patients that I was attracting, but I wasn't admitting patients as much into the psychiatric hospital. So as a young student in studying and working in London, I'd also been a little bit off the wall. I got pulled in by the medical superintendent of the hospital because they said my drug bill was higher than anybody else's as a junior doctor. And when we evaluated it, it wasn't because I was using more drugs than other people. It was because I put all my schizophrenic patients on vitamins and omegas because I thought that their brains were malnourished. So there was always that openness. And then I was constantly researching the mysticism. I belonged to a kind of secret psychiatry sect. We met in an underground crypt in Regent Street where we talked about spirituality and psychiatry and about whether or not entities existed and exorcisms. And, I didn't know anything about this, but there were these ancient people who were talking about it. And I was very interested in hypnosis at that time. And as a young person, I then also went and about 15 or 18 years ago, went and did ayahuasca in the Amazon with shamans, which then gave me a completely different framework of what we're doing in psychiatry is just one aspect of health. There's this other big part that we're missing.
Or it's one view.
Yes, it's one perspective.
It's one perspective. Yes, one perspective, and it may not be the truest one, so we might be medicating people that need to feel those things or that need to see those entities.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know. What do you think about that?
And really, I think what I started to realize in my own life was that I, as a psychiatrist, did not like other people feeling anything but happy because my own harmony aspect, I didn't want them to feel uncomfortable. So I'll do anything in my power to make you feel okay. But in so doing, I was disempowering you. I needed to trust that you could do this without medication, that you could sojourn in nature for 2 weeks and that you'd feel so much better. And it so changed my practice completely. And I was doing integrative and functional treatments for my clients. I wasn't admitting them, which caused problems for the hospital because I wasn't making a lot of money for the hospital. I was then going on consultations into the forest with my clients instead of having them in my rooms. And so I think it's just my natural proclivity to understand that human beings have a deeply spiritual component. And as psychiatrists, even in psychiatry, we're removed from hospitals usually. Originally it was asylums, and then we were kind of ejected away from hospitals. So we didn't even want to be part of the body anymore. And I think what's beautiful now is that we're starting to integrate all these facets again. We're starting to have conversations about spirituality and psychiatry and about inflammation and mental well-being. It's going to provide people with a much better foundation of sustainable health, I think.
As you're speaking, right, one of the biggest issues that we have, I'm thinking, is that this word mental well-being, what is that? Actually, as I think, you must correct me if I'm wrong, but as I think, it's actually, it just means that I can't find any physical damage in you. So I'm going to call it you're mentally ill. But actually, it's all one. right? It's all one. So it's also, is it okay for us? I'll be ever mentally well, but physically very sick. I don't know. Is that possible? Is it possible for me to have like a failing kidney, but I'm mentally well, but my kidney is failing? Is that?
So I guess, I mean, I've never really considered those topics. I think they're really important. I guess it's how you define mentally well. So somebody who, we had a little boy live with us who died, and he had kidney failure. And I would say that he was mentally really well, although he was going and getting dialysis every week, and he was swollen, completely swollen because of the cortisone injections. But he was playful and engaging and angelic in nature. And yeah, I felt like he was mentally well, although, I think that the toxicity of not having a well-functioning kidney didn't make it necessarily easier. I think he was much more fatigued and probably had a bit of cognitive slow-ache. So I think it's different, really. But I think outlook is what you're kind of talking to.
I guess what I'm feeling is like, whether I'm mentally uncomfortable or physically uncomfortable, I'm uncomfortable. And it's one thing, comfortable, and it's like, I guess, you're right. As I said that, I was like, no, you're right. I mean, there are people that can be very positive and happy, and I guess as happy as they can be, but they're still uncomfortable. And I suppose as we were talking about psychiatry being separate from the hospital, and then I was thinking, yeah, but discomfort is discomfort, or being unwell is being unwell.
But working in hospice for a period of time, sometimes patients would get to a point where they were in such deep acceptance of the discomfort and physical ill health that it provided them an openness of mental clarity and just incredible well-being and gratitude. So yeah, I think there are many different ways you could look at that part.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about loneliness, and I'm thinking, what if we could become comfortable with feeling alone and just accept it? Like, okay, I feel alone. I mean, could that be a gateway to something?
Yes. Yes, I think that's the first starting block is acknowledging, okay, I'm alone. And what is this bringing up for me? And can I start to use it as this navigating tool, compass, to identify what parts feel delicious about the aloneness and what parts feel really scary? And can I tend to those scary bits? Because I've got it within me. I don't have to seek medical intervention outside of myself and be given an antidepressant because I'm feeling lonely. I don't need to necessarily go and join all sorts of clubs, although belonging is very important. I do think there has to be this tenacity to observe what aspects are avoidant. So introverted people might have behavior patterns that make intimacy a little more complicated. So for example, I would much rather type on my WhatsApps than do a voice note or actually pick up the phone. And what I should actually be doing is picking up the phone and going, hey, do you want to meet for coffee? And going for coffee. So I've noticed that little pattern within me when I get into, whatever it might be, that I can go into that aspect. Or that, we have the avoidance of not really connecting to the people in our neighborhood, to our favorite barrister, to the people who help us in our house or whoever. These are all little moments for us to practice depth.
Yeah, you know how I feel about that, as you said about the barista. I felt like, why do I not do that? I feel like I don't do that because I feel like they wouldn't want to connect with me. Like, I feel like that guy is busy. He's busy. He's got a lot of things to do. That person's... I wonder if other people feel like that too. Like, they wouldn't...
Legit, but it's about experimenting. So it's, it's really, sometimes I do this with my kids, and I'll say, like, how much magic can you create for people in a day? So how many, because of your own smile, how many contagious smiles can then you induce? And when you're playful and open to the barista, there's always a response, really. And because we're in Africa, there's usually a much more positive war response. And I think that's what's so lovely about South Africans is that we generally want to have this open camaraderie type of connection.
I'd like you to just talk a little bit about what you currently are doing and what you plan to do, because you talked a little bit before we started recording about this conference you went to in Ireland, and then you mentioned the safe house. I just want you to chat a bit about that.
I took my family out of school last year and we went traveling for 4 months, and then I closed my psychiatric practice, and I thought I was going to reopen it, but I didn't. And off the back of that, I become much more interested in the initiation process for leaders. How do we really start to support what I'm calling a luminous leadership program, where we identify that we're all in our individual rights leaders, and that there is a process of development, psychological development and spiritual development, to become a true, authentic servant leader. So that part is very interesting for me, and it may entail a psychedelic journey or it may not, depending on the person that's interested. And then I think really because of my awareness of the collective shadow coming up to be healed, because we're moving into a space over the next, I don't know how long, just a couple of centuries, where we're trying to move into a place of unity consciousness. And, the artificial intelligence is a physical manifestation of that. There's a need to kind of interconnect, although it has an enormous amount of shadow aspects. But that's what we're trying to do as human beings. We're coming from a very polarized individual process into more joint, collaborative, community-orientated processes. But in order to do that with purity, we need to look at the shadow aspects of us and our collective. And for me, the thing that really burns into my soul is the way that children are abused. And so I'm very keen to support the establishment of safe houses for battered children, which are very poorly funded by our government and social development. So that's another arm, really. It's just supporting the fundraising and the awareness of
For children who are abused, and then in those safe houses, you would also provide them with support, like the support to possibly heal from their.
Yeah, so I mean, not necessarily me, but social workers or play therapists, trauma specialists, and we don't have enough. So if anybody wants to train, that would be really a really good thing to train in, is kind of compassionate inquiry and trauma process work. But yes, these little ones are the most lonely fragments of our society. I mean, to not, from a young age, to never have felt secure or nourished, to never have had one, probably a single adult, could tell you that they properly belong, to have a community, a society that is so dysfunctional and busy, to also not belong. I mean, it's really, these are the leaders of our next generation. If we don't take care, there will be really significant problems, worse problems than just loneliness and mental health issues.
I think like us with our very privileged backgrounds, if we carry around so much trauma and we struggle a lifetime trying to overcome those traumas, if we're lucky, actually, because we might just live in them. But then I think about children like this and children that have had much greater trauma and like never. I've experienced love, I mean, but then when I think about a child who's never experienced that, or who has no sense of feeling, that must be so isolating. And I feel like that's really, that's amazing. Thank you on behalf of society for.
No, really, my role is very minimal. There's some very powerful queens who are running the show, who have started these sort of support systems in their dining rooms in their homes. So the accolades cannot go to me at all for that. But it is just a position, a platform that I can share. But I think, as you say, even in our privileged places, I think what's happening with light workers, for want of a better word, or people who are very interested in spirituality, or people who have means, is that we may not just be working on our own issues. What we might be doing is tending to the collective grief and trauma. So I know within my own life, I experience things that I know fundamentally are not related to my early background. It cannot be so. But the way that I empathize and have connection and resonance with it, I know that I'm tending to a part of the collective in that aspect. And I think that's potent work for people who are aware of that at the moment.
Do you have any final things you'd like to share? Just like what you would like to see somebody struggling with loneliness, or what your advice would be rather to someone who's struggling with feeling alone and feeling disconnected from themselves, from their families.
I've got a beautiful poem that I'll share, but I think just as a caveat to one of our earlier parts of our conversations, in this much more kind of spiritually orientated world that we're in, I think the spiritual bypassing is really important to tend to. So, because I think people feel very lonely, and then they seek spiritual salvation, which is great, but sometimes it can also deny the very human aspect of loneliness. And sometimes meditation, whilst fundamentally a critical skill to have, can also be dissociative, and it could just be this bliss state or the void state that we're experiencing whilst not tending to what it actually feels like to be in a body. Or we can rationalize that, it's all one, and this is all an illusion, and I don't have to tend to this really uncomfortable part of me. And I think that's also bypassing. And then the third is also to remember that sometimes the very spiritually prominent people on Instagram, or the ones making a lot of noise, and I admire them for whatever they are offering to the world, for sure, is that it can also come from a path that requires validation, or is fearful or needing of something. And there's kind of a new age glow, I think, to spirituality that might also be a little superficial. We need to, be very discerning about the depth of things. It's not just all love and light. The shadow work is very intense and complicated.
Yeah, I agree with you so much about this, because we could get in, like, seriously into the wrong hands and start just, it's just sad for us if we do that, because maybe it's also part of the learning journey if you eventually realize. But one of my questions that I keep asking myself is that, how do I know who is authentic and who is not?
Yes.
And I had a Sufi teacher, which we talked about before, and my Sufi teacher used to say, in order to choose a sheikh, like your teacher, your guide, you must live with that person day and night and watch them and watch all their actions to know whether this person is truly, pure and is almost like is worthy of being a teacher.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I know that's at least that's in the Sufi tradition, or what he taught, what he said to us about it. But now I wonder, with a lot of, and especially now because there is so much talk around, like meditation, manifestation, and they're all, I think I appreciate it for what it is, which is it's giving people hope after coming out of a really dark time, especially like through COVID. And so I think it's giving people hope. I also think it's great because it's causing the younger generation, and like the guys that are in school now, that's like amazing for them to grow up in a questioning way.
Exactly.
So we
With awareness.
Yes, so we don't accept just the establishment. I talked to you about this a little bit before, but like my father had a really bad time in the hospital before he passed. I was really, really upset about it. But what was so interesting about the way he was that he just felt like before that, before he went to the hospital, he just felt like, no, like the doctor said it, I'm going to do it. Like, that's it. We don't question it. But I'm glad that we're able to just have a questioning mindset, approach.
Yes.
Yeah.
And to have that same questioning mindset for ourselves, allow our beliefs to be dissolved and to be reestablished, to reinvigorate, reinvent ourselves all the time, to have a little more fluidity about ourselves. Yeah. And so kind of, I think that David Whyte, he's just the most beautiful poet, said it so beautifully. This is just an excerpt of this poem on loneliness. Loneliness is the doorway to unspecified desire. Loneliness can be a prison, a place which we look out into the world we cannot inhabit. Loneliness is the very state that births courage when fully lived can undergo its own beautiful reversal. Loneliness is the foundation of belonging, this gravitational field drawing us home, the essence of its isolation reaching for togetherness. So to allow ourselves to feel fully alive is to allow ourselves to understand our incarnation, that aloneness as our friend is to apprentice ourselves to our unutterable singularity. But a singularity that can kiss, it can create conversation, it can make a vow. And so loneliness is just the body constellating to join other bodies. It is the single malt taste that makes belonging possible. And the doorway closer than you think. I feel alone, therefore I must belong. Isn't that beautiful?
It's amazing. What Algid? Oh, God, it's very, very deep. Yeah, I actually want to read that one. Okay, thank you, Dr. Shiv. Thanks for listening today. I hope you found today's episode insightful and inspiring. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with a friend. Subscribing helps a new podcast like ours immensely. And until next time, don't be a sheep, keep questioning, stay curious, and never stop exploring the extraordinary.